theme of forest health, we're gonna go on to forest diseases. Now we've got Robin Mulvey up next. He's also over in Juneau. Robin has been a forest pathologist with the Forest Health Protection within the state, private and tribal forestry branch of the U.S. Forest Service since 2011. Robin's pathology interests span diverse topics from yellow cedar decline to heart rots to foliage diseases. Robin has a passion for tough trees like short pine and yellow cedar that are able to survive under marginal conditions of harsh environments. She enjoys working with land managers to mitigate disease impacts and conducting forest health assessments across Southeast Alaska. Crown Forest Hives. Outside of work, she enjoys hiking, running, playing guitar, and spending time with her two children, both in elementary school. So with that, Robin, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Pat. Did they make you read that upside down? Just kidding. So I'll start up my presentation. Hopefully everything goes smoothly. I just wanted to come on screen briefly and show that I'm not AI, unlike Damien. So yeah, let me stop the video and I'll get started. And just let me know if anything appears to not be working for me. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the status of forest diseases and declines in Southeast Alaska. And, you know, I don't have anything quite as flashy as outbreaks across 500,000 acres, but I do have some exciting things to talk about, including some of the more subtle roles of forest diseases in our ecosystems. So Liz already shared this. Sorry, that is my dog in the background. She already shared these resources and told a little bit about where we're situated within the state, private, and tribal forestry branch of the Forest Service, but we work across all lands because of the extent of insect and disease outbreaks. And so we conduct evaluation monitoring work across all of these lands through a combination of aerial and ground detection surveys, targeted projects, and then also remote sensing like some of the projects and maps that Liz pointed out. We also provide technical assistance to meet the needs of federal, state, and private stakeholders and tribal nations. So check out our website and you can just Google Alaska Forest Health to get there. So I'll just jump into this. There are some diseases that respond rapidly to temperature and precipitation patterns. And so I've included a couple examples here, but these are things that I kind of key into these diseases, kind of like the canary in the coal mine, that something is happening and we can kind of follow some of those diseases to see what specific changes in temperature or precipitation might be driving the damage. So examples on Western hemlock in the top left is Suricoccus shoot blight. That's a cone disease and a shoot blight disease. In the lower left, we have a really similar disease, yellow shoot blight of yellow cedar. And this summer, I'm hoping to potentially do a common garden study at the Heen experimental forest north of Juneau, where they planted yellow cedar from different families and rows. And when I visited the site last year, a lot of the trees looked really hammered with the shoot blight disease. And so, and it didn't seem like it was the same all across the planting site. So that gives us a neat opportunity to look at heritability of disease susceptibility. Then we have Dothostroma needle blight disease. This is one, you know, shore pine's a non-commercial species, but really important in our muskegs. And this is one of those really tough trees that is able to eke out a living on those nutrient poor, very high water table sites. But when it's over 63 degrees Fahrenheit and there's at least trace precipitation, I always call that a Dothostroma day because those are the specific requirements for this disease. And if you get several days or even weeks on end with those specific requirements met, you can get a significant outbreak. And up in Gustavus from about, well, 2009 was when they had those perfect conditions. And then we monitored an outbreak there with study plots from about 2012-13 to 16. And we saw more than half of the trees in heavily impacted areas died from that outbreak. So like Liz was saying with the insects, if we have a foliage disease, it's not like it's not usually killing the host tree. It's affecting the foliage. It can look really bad, but the trees are able to recover over time. But if you have a really severe outbreak and they're hit again and again and again, they don't have the resources to survive that kind of intense foliage loss. And so that's what we saw there. Last year on Prince of Wales Island, I saw more cedar leaf blight on western red cedar than I had seen before. And so this is a disease to watch because it's also linked to specific moisture and temperature requirements. And then I just included these two on the right, more foliage diseases, hemlock needle rust of western hemlock and spruce needle rust on spruce. So there are other diseases. I kind of categorize these separately because these are diseases that are more or less stable over time. And these include things like hemlock dwarf mistletoe and our stem decays. And they serve essential ecological roles in coastal rainforests, and they're a major part of the gap scale disturbance that helps to create the structure that Damien was talking about in his talk about, like, what are these defining characteristics of old growth? Well, a lot of that has to do with the mortality of individual trees, and those trees can remain standing, like you see with hemlock dwarf mistletoe, if there's infection all throughout the crown of the tree. And that creates a gap in the canopy at that point. With stem decays, you're more likely to see the trees snap in half under some wind. And then you can have complete tree uprooting from wind disturbance. So those are really common kind of smaller, usually smaller scale disturbances in our forest here. In contrast to old growth forests, both of these, stem decays and hemlock dwarf mistletoe, are uncommon or even absent in young managed stands after clear cut harvest, unless there's heavy wounding from machinery that can introduce the stem decays. But these organisms move really slowly across the landscape, and they kind of build up over time. And so in young stands, they're almost completely eliminated. And from a timber production standpoint, that's great. You want to have fast growing trees. You don't necessarily want stems breaking from stem decay. But on the other hand, if there are other objectives for wildlife habitat that you're looking to meet, those are really important parts of the ecosystem. So they did some really nice call studies in the 1950s and 70s that show very high rates of defect in old growth forests. And the graphs on the left side, I just included Sitka spruce and western hemlock. But in those studies, they also, this is from the Kimmy study in particular, they also included western red cedar. And you can see that as trees get older, they have a much higher incidence of decay. So on the left, it's the percent of trees with decay, and on the right, the graph is the volume call. And some people are surprised that western red cedar also actually has the most defect as a standing live tree, even though as wood in service, it's very decay resistant. And so these forms of damage, stem decay and hemlock dwarf mistletoe, they may change noticeably over a much longer scale, decades or centuries or multiple centuries. And so I just wanted to kind of point out as stands initiate after a larger scale disturbance, there are certain successional patterns that they follow as they make their way towards old growth at about 250 years. And so you start to see stem decays develop at about 125 to 150 years, but I'm sure that varies by forest type and the type of stem decay that comes into a forest. Now there's a forest really close to my house in Juneau. It's called the Brotherhood Bridge Trail. And in that forest, it's a primary forest following glacial recession. It's been fascinating to watch the accumulation of stem decays. And right now it's in a really exciting period of, we called it in grad school, forest violence, where there's a really high incidence of stems snapping, especially associated with the root and butt rot Phaeola schweinitziae. It's also called the cowpie fungus or Dyer's polypore. But I think that there are probably these key periods of stand development where these stem decays are really playing a critical role in changes in the forest composition and structure. And I wanted to point out another example of change with hemlock dwarf mistletoe. You know, based on where it occurs, we've used FIA plot data to look at where it occurs and compared to where does the host occur. And there seems to be an elevation and latitude limit for hemlock dwarf mistletoe. It's a parasitic plant, and it doesn't seem to occur over 500 feet in elevation. And then its cutoff is right around Haines and Skagway. But modeling efforts have shown that, like, if we use the climate envelope for those areas and kind of look forward, what is the climate expected to be throughout the range of Western hemlock moving forward? And then where do we expect Western hemlock to be in the future? And we see that both of them are climate winners, as they say, that they're both expected to expand their range with a changing climate. And so, but the problem and the limitation with these models is that they don't incorporate the actual biological spread rate of organisms. So if you have something like hemlock dwarf mistletoe that can barely make its way into a clear cut right next door, it takes, you know, decades to centuries to do that. You can imagine it would also be very difficult for it to expand its range, you know, far westward, especially if there are geographic barriers. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you look at any kind of modeling effort, that it doesn't include all of these other important variables. Now, yellow cedar decline is one of my major areas of interest, and I was fortunate to overlap with Paul Hennon, who worked to determine the mechanism of yellow cedar decline, what's actually killing the trees over a more than 30-year career in Southeast Alaska. But this is a climate-driven forest decline that's caused by freezing injury to fine roots in spring. And I said false spring there in parentheses because not only do the tissues have to activate with warming temperatures, but that has to be followed by a freezing event. So you need to have shallow soil and roots, and a lot of the sites where yellow cedar is able to compete best have those characteristics, and so their roots are close to the soil surface. The tissues need to be active for growth. Yellow cedar doesn't go into a true winter dormancy. One of its adaptive traits is that it's able to take advantage of warmer periods to conduct photosynthesis. But when it's in that active state, it's extremely vulnerable to cold events. When it gets below 23 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees C, that's the temperature threshold that creates problems for this root freezing injury. And yellow cedar is protected from that freezing injury and that soil temperature fluctuation if there's enough snowpack. So you have to have all of those factors in line to create the conditions for tree decline and eventual tree mortality. But this problem has been occurring over a century in Southeast Alaska, and there's not concern that yellow cedar will become extinct, but the populations and the seed source are severely impacted. So even in the areas where you know, the trees stay standing for 80 to 100 years or more after tree death, and so you can see the legacy of yellow cedar decline across the landscape. But in the areas that look the worst, you still have about 20% of trees surviving, and that's mature trees surviving. And so we think that those surviving legacy trees are either protected by microsite, their roots are just deeper and a better spot, they're not affected by freezing, or they're able to tolerate that freezing. They have a little bit greater cold tolerance, or maybe they don't come out of dormancy as early. But because of the climate cause of this issue, we see decline extending upslope and northward with reduced snowpack. And in the last couple of years, we've started to detect some yellow cedar mortality up on the outer coast of Glacier Bay. And so that's something that I'm hoping to get on the ground to verify is caused by the same mechanism as what we've seen elsewhere in Southeast Alaska. We have also started to see yellow cedar decline impacts in managed young growth stands, and that's another topic that I'm very interested in. We established monitoring plots in 5 of the most severely affected young growth stands with yellow cedar. 3 of them were on Zarembo Island, 1 on Wrangell, and then 1 on Kupernoff, just across from Petersburg. And that was a real team effort. We had district help, and then my whole forest health team was really awesome in installing those plots. And I went back to remeasure, 5 years later, the plots on Zarembo last year, and it was really interesting. It was interesting to see that the decline really is progressing there. I had kind of hoped that maybe those stars aligned just for a short blip in those young growth stands, and that we would not see continued damage, but that does not appear to be the case. The mortality, the percent of yellow cedar that were dead in the plots that we checked on Zarembo had doubled since we installed the plot in 2018. If you are interested in learning more about yellow cedar decline, definitely check out our website. And on there is a climate adaptation strategy for conservation and management of yellow cedar in Alaska. This was published in 2016, and there's so much information. It's a very thick report. So you can learn about the sylvics of yellow cedar, how they unraveled, the mechanism of yellow cedar decline, management that can promote yellow cedar on the landscape moving forward. And I think one of my favorite parts of this document is the appendix that it basically divides the range of yellow cedar in Alaska into 33 management zones. And for each, it describes the geomorphology and climate, the extent of yellow cedar, the extent of decline, the future risk of decline, the extent of active management zones, because if there is an active management conducted in an area, you're not going to be able to go out and thin or plant to favor yellow cedar. And then, so it kind of dives into some of these opportunities for conservation and management given those things. And so I think this is really cool. There are some places where most of the yellow cedar decline that is going to occur has already occurred. And so you can kind of take that information and choose management strategies to promote yellow cedar across the landscape. Yellow cedar is not very competitive with spruce and hemlock, so it can be favored and planted, but it's really important to plant it on sites with deeper soils so that it can have that protection from freezing injury. That's the main take home there. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing on time, but I'm close to the end here. The other thing that I've been working on is looking at Western red cedar health. We have come to understand that there are two causes of crown dieback for Western red cedar in Southeast Alaska. One is drought injury, and I'm actually pretty concerned with the dry weather we've had. I mean, I've been enjoying it, as I'm sure many of you have, but I'm concerned that the timing of this drought in spring, as trees are coming out of dormancy, may be problematic for Western red cedar. And we haven't seen a lot of drought damage in Southeast Alaska, but there are a couple locations on Prince of Wales Island and Ketchikan where you're seeing crowns die back over time. And then the second one that I've actually studied in more depth is stem feeding damage. And there's animal feeding damage. It's not on the branches, it's just on the main stem. And it causes Western red cedar to be girdled at whatever height the girdling wounds occur. And so I'm gonna flip forward because I've talked out of order. I'm gonna flip forward to this and then I'll come back. The top kill that we're seeing is caused by girdling stem wounds. And this isn't the first time it's been documented. It's also been noted on Prince of Wales Island in the 1980s and 90s. And so what we did was we mapped and sampled affected trees. I sampled 15 trees destructively and I collected all the wound tissue. And we think that the Prince of Wales flying squirrel is the most likely culprit for this damage. I say here that we're awaiting DNA confirmation, but I actually just found out that they ran all of our samples to look for environmental DNA of any mammals, and they could not find anything, probably because of there are compounds in cedar bark and tissues that can inhibit our ability to sequence DNA from those species. And so that may be what has occurred here. So I was hoping to have an answer for everyone, but here's our flying squirrel. And but what we did with all of those wound samples is that we were able to make cross sections of each wound and use the tree ring growth and patterns to determine when the wounding occurred and the most likely season for that wounding. And so these wounds generally occur really high on the tree. The average was 18.5 feet. They affect kind of narrower stem tissues where the bark is a little bit thinner. And most trees were wounded across years. It wasn't just like this tree was wounded just in 2018 and wasn't wounded again. Most of them have a legacy of wounding. So that's been a fun project to work on, and I was hoping to kind of bring it to fruition now, but might have to wait a little bit longer. The reason I wanted to go back to this slide is that there is interest in Western red cedar health and this kind of drought susceptibility across the range of Western red cedar. So not just Alaska, and actually most of this has been centered in Oregon and Washington. They have an iNaturalist project for collecting data on both healthy and declining Western red cedar. So if you have an interest in this topic, be sure to check out these resources. The story map on the topic is from Betsy Goodrich, and that came out last April. So this is something that I'm really hoping to dive into, especially given our current spring drought. Liz covered our online resources really well, and that's all I got. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll take any questions if you have them.
All right, well, thanks, Robin. Looking around the room, we've got one question in the room here.
Are you unmuted? Yes, can you hear me, Robin?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Could you repeat the reasoning for why we should not expect a significantly more yellow cedar decline? You had said most of what will occur has occurred. Could you just repeat the reasoning behind that? I didn't quite follow.
Yeah, thanks for that clarifying question. I didn't mean that all of it everywhere has occurred. I was thinking about specific situations. Last year I went to Metlakatla on Annette Island, and so I was producing a summary for them of, like how could they manage for more yellow cedar, and essentially they all of the places with yellow cedar that have hydrology, shallow soils that are going to have the roots close to the soil surface already have inadequate snow. So we're not expecting snow loss to contribute to further future decline. Does that make sense? There are other places where snow loss can certainly contribute to future decline, but in that specific management zone, their strategy then is to identify sites with deep soils for planting yellow cedar if they want to promote it on the landscape. And the yellow cedar that has not yet been affected is presumably protected by deeper soils already because there's not enough snow, or there's, sorry, I have a cold today, so I'm kind of fumbling my way through this, but basically all of those models are using the loss of snowpack and combined with hydrology.
Lose you, Robin? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I think you just we lost you there for a second, but you're back. So, all right, any other questions online or in the room for Robin? All right, well, thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I wish I could be there.
I wish you two could be here, Robin. Maybe next